Imagine a world teetering on the edge of the familiar. A place where the fabric of the everyday begins to unravel, revealing glimpses of the extraordinary lurking beneath. You're about to embark on a journey into the enigmatic, where the peculiar and the perplexing intertwine, where every tale twists the mind and tugs at the spirit. It's a descent into the strange, the mysterious, and the unexplained. This is When Reality Frays. New episodes are published every Monday and Thursday, and When Reality Frays is available everywhere podcasts are found. Before we move on, please hit that follow or subscribe button and turn on all reminders so you're alerted when new episodes are released. Today's episode contains one story entitled Evil Whispers. In the decaying Rust Belt city of Ashwick, Timothy Carver, a wiry mechanic of 32, lived a quiet life. His garage was a cluttered shop with oil-stained concrete and cinderblock walls with faded paint that still advertised a failed restaurant. Just like the city, it was eroded by neglect. As summer drew to a close and the mornings became crisp with autumn's chill, a pervasive sense of dread settled over Timothy. He couldn't explain it at first, but it wasn't long before he noticed something odd. He had two shadows. At first, he passed it off as a trick of the light caused by the mismatched fluorescent tubes in the shop's overhead, until he went outside. Walking across the parking lot's cracked pavement, he saw a second shadow, lagging a half second behind his movements. Its edges were subtly frayed, and it stretched slightly too long even for his lean frame. He tested it, suddenly freezing mid-step. The new shadow came to a stop a fraction of a second later. It was a subtle difference, one a casual observer wouldn't likely spot, but something was definitely off. He swung the wrench in his hand, his eyes locked on the ground, and again noted a hesitation where there shouldn't be one. Turning, he suddenly sprinted for the shop. It was almost a full second before the shadow followed, catching up with him as he entered the building. Back inside, he dashed into the restroom and looked into the mirror above the sink. He caught the briefest of glances of a black figure with burning eyes before it merged with what he thought of as his actual shadow. Timothy's heart raced and he whirled to face it, but there was nothing there. Until the shadow moved without him, a deliberate tilt of its head, as if it no longer cared that he knew it was there. Sweat slicked his palms, and he tried to bury the fear, but it took root like a cold splinter in his chest. Timothy fled, charging up the stairs to the small apartment above the shop where he lived. He couldn't see the shadow following, but it was there when he came to a stop near his bed, panting from his all-out sprint. The shadow separated from him, its form cast across the wall by a single bulb's dim glow. Its limbs were unnaturally long, with fingers curling like talons. Timothy turned to run, but before he could take a step, the shadow enveloped him in an embrace that burned like fire, while sending bolts of jagged ice into his head. He tried to scream, but no sound came out, and he collapsed to the floor and lost consciousness. Timothy woke gasping, a cold weight pressing his chest, like a hand pinning him to the floor. The shadow was no longer a silhouette, but a three-dimensional mass, gaunt, towering, swaying over him as it invaded his mind with thoughts, smashing an employee's skull with a wrench, dousing the neighboring bar in gasoline and tossing a match, driving his truck through a crowded market. The thoughts became vivid urges playing in his mind like a movie, urging him to act. He fought them, but the shadow's weight grew, grinding his bones and clouding his thoughts. Then, with its poisonous seeds planted, it released him and rejoined his actual shadow. Timothy was shaken from the experience, left panting in terror. Part of him understood the thoughts playing in his head weren't his own, but they grew progressively more violent, and they evolved, a siren's call steadily chipping away at his resistance. He withdrew, employees and customers giving him strange looks, but there was no one he was close enough with to recognize he was fighting a battle for his soul. He avoided the bar, the store, any place that he saw in his visions. In mirrors, he began seeing something standing behind him, a shadowy skeletal figure looming just over his shoulder, its darkness dimming the room and its eyeless gaze boring into him. Every time he saw it, the violent thoughts grew louder, commanding him to snap the neck of the drunk outside the bar, burn the church to ash, crush the old man at the gas station. Each dictate felt more and more as if it were his idea, his desire, and his resistance faltered. One moonless night, the shadow's weight drove him from his apartment, a large wrench clutched tightly in his fist. He had no conscious destination and wound up in a dark alley behind the bar. A drunk stumbled out, unaware of his presence. Timothy stepped behind the man and swung the wrench with all his might, caving in the drunk's skull. Timothy stared down at the man he had just murdered, guilt and revulsion churning in his stomach, but the shadow wrapped him in its darkness and calmed his racing mind. For the first time since he was a child, Timothy felt love. With a spring in his step, he hurried back to his shop, dropped the wrench in a vat of industrial acid, and went to bed. The shadow lurked, invisible in a dark corner of the room, but he could feel its praise as he drifted off to sleep. Days later, he acted again. The gas station erupted in flames, the old man who owned it screaming as the fire consumed him. Timothy watched from a distance. Guilt pierced him, bile rising in his throat, but the shadow embraced him, comforted him. The next morning, he woke after an incredibly vivid dream and climbed into his truck. He drove to the school, and when he spotted a group of teens in a crosswalk, his foot pressed the accelerator to the floor. A part of his mind screamed, fighting the shadow's pull, and at the last possible instant he swerved. Enraged, the shadow wrapped him in its darkness, its weight crushing his ribs until he couldn't breathe. When it released him, any thoughts of disobedience he might have had been purged. Timothy's acts grew reckless. He vandalized cars with crowbars and slashed tires. He torched a church, beat a homeless man, leaving him broken and bloody in a ditch. And each act fed the shadow. Its form sharpened until it was a towering mass of insatiable evil. His body weakened, his steps dragging, as if the shadow was also siphoning his life. Now, mirrors showed only a darkness that writhed with malevolent intent. Closing the garage, he locked himself inside, terrified of the monster he was becoming. But the shadow's commands were relentless. Slit the postman's throat. Build a bomb and plant it in a grocery store timed to go off at the peak of business. Kill until the town was silent. But people had noticed the change in Timothy, the closed shop, the plywood covering the garage's few windows. The police came, but he refused to answer the door, and they eventually left. but he knew they'd be back with a reason to force their way in. And there was enough evidence in the building for him to spend the rest of his life in prison. Driven by revulsion of his acts and fear of being caught, a spark of resistance bloomed within Timothy. He fought the urges. The shadow raged in an attempt to regain control. It towered over Timothy, claws scraping the pavement, commanding him to go out and slaughter the entire town. A pistol was in his hand, a large knife in his waistband. But in a moment of clarity, he saw the monster he had allowed himself to become. With a scream, he fired the gun into the shadow, refusing to give it the blood it craved. But the shadow was unharmed, and when he fired his last shot, its weight slammed into him like a storm, and they fought. Not with fists or weapons, but with will. The shadow's rage chilled the air, but somehow Timothy found the strength to resist. But he knew his will wouldn't hold for long. He dashed outside, the shadow following and wreathing him in its darkness, but it couldn't stop him. He jumped into his truck and fled. The town's lights faded in his rear view, but the shadow's weight clung, cold and heavy, its form slithering in the truck's shadows. But the farther away he drove, the fainter the shadow became until it was completely gone when he crossed into a neighboring state. Exhausted, he stopped in a grimy town called Victor, a speck of old motels and diners. He rented a room, and for the first time in what seemed years, he immediately fell into a deep, dreamless slumber. When he woke, Timothy felt reborn. He showered, optimistic for a new day, free of the shadow. But when he stepped out of the bathroom, he recoiled to find it waiting for him. Immediately, the urges returned. Strangle the motel clerk, burn the diner, smash a stranger's skull. Timothy's hands shook as he raced out the door and leapt into his truck, the shadow pursuing and enveloping him. He fought, screaming in pain as his skin burned and his very soul began being crushed. Tendrils of evil wormed their way into his mind, and he realized this was a different shadow. The same as the one he had fled, but different. Timothy was able to start the truck and drive away, despite the physical pain and mental anguish of the battle. Surprisingly, the farther he went from the tiny town, the fainter the shadow appeared until it was gone altogether. A couple of hours later, Timothy stopped for gas at a truck stop on the edge of a small town. While his pickup was filling, he went to use the facilities and encountered yet another shadow. It was standing in the corner of the restroom, apparently unseen by anyone else. And it seemed to recognize him, coming forward to wrap him up while urging him to set fire to the fueling pumps. It followed him when he ran, demanding he kill the family he raced past. It appeared in his truck as he screeched away, but as before, it faded with distance until it was gone. Timothy dreaded having to stop again. When he needed to relieve himself, he found a side road far from civilization and drove down it a few miles before stepping out. But there was no alternative to refueling his truck. He stopped again as the sun was brushing the western horizon. He swiped a credit card and got gas pumping as quickly as possible. As the truck filled, he kept his eyes roving in anticipation of another shadow, and only a few minutes had passed when he saw one flit around the corner of the building. He was prepared and didn't hesitate to slam the gas nozzle into place on the pump and leap behind the wheel. He tore out of the lot with a screech of tires, his heart pounding as he watched the shadow in the mirror. It was pursuing him, gaining ground at first, but finally fading and falling behind as he drew farther away from the filling station. Timothy now understood. The shadows were everywhere. For a reason he couldn't fathom, it seemed they were tethered to locations they couldn't leave. He drove into the night, no destination, only the need to stay ahead. Town after town, he ran, each stop marked by a different shadow's appearance. But the urges were the same: maim and murder, destroy. Occasionally, he would spot them on empty stretches of highway, but the closer he approached towns and cities, the more he saw. His life became a blur of highways, his body wasting, his soul fraying, forever fleeing the shadows and the evil they encouraged. One night, exhaustion sat heavy on his shoulders. He was somewhere in the desolate stretches of Wyoming and hadn't seen a shadow since passing through Casper. Pulling to the side of the road, he drove far enough out into the grasslands that his truck couldn't be seen from the highway. Shutting the engine off, darkness and near-perfect silence descended. Here, in isolation, he allowed himself to feel safe, to relax, to let his guard down long enough to sleep and recharge. He finished a cigarette and crawled into the truck, stretching across the bench seat. Timothy awoke with the sunrise. He stepped from the cab, looking about in search of a shadow, and breathing a sigh of relief when he didn't find one. But as he looked around, he noticed smoke coming from beyond a distant ridgeline. Curiosity got the best of him, and he began walking. Cresting the ridge, he looked down at a small encampment of tents. Two of the tents were burning furiously, as if they'd been doused with something very flammable. A scream floated on the still morning air, and a bloody woman burst out of a tent. Frantic, she dashed about, shouting for help. Another woman came out of a different tent. She held up a plastic bottle and squirted the contents onto the frantic woman, who recoiled in horror. The terrified woman tried to run, but tripped and fell to the ground. Before she could rise, the other woman dashed in and sparked a lighter. Flames whooshed to life, and she backed away as the woman writhed on the ground, screaming in horrific pain. The woman who had started the fire stood calmly, watching her handiwork. Then he saw the shadow, standing on the far side of the camp. It rippled in the morning light as it moved between the tents to envelop the woman, almost like a lover. He watched a moment as it comforted her, then ran for his truck. That's it for this episode. If you're enjoying the stories, please support the podcast by buying me a coffee. The link is in the episode show notes, and I would greatly appreciate your support. New episodes of the When Reality Phrase podcast are released every Monday and Thursday. If you're enjoying the journey into the strange, the mysterious, and the unexplained, be sure to press that follow or subscribe button and turn on all reminders so you're alerted whenever an episode drops. Until next time, thank you for listening to When Reality Phrase.